There is a moment in the oldest stories when the sky breaks. That's impossible.
Not the painted sky in church windows. Not the sky poets lie about. The real sky.
Why does it feel alive?
Get inside!
When the sky breaks, the world remembers what it truly is. Small.
Your Majesty, the protocols demand you leave the windows. My father hid from eclipses. And your grandfather. They died anyway. If darkness wants its king, it can come take him itself.
Your Majesty! Come here!
You're freezing.
Do not be afraid!
I think it's too late for that.
Marin. Marin of Holt.
Marin.
Your Majesty? You died.
I know.
How are you here?
I don't remember dying. I only remember your face.
Music settles into something atmospheric and vast. Strings, distant horns. Before the dying, there was the kingdom. Ashenvale, named for the gray mist that rose every morning from the valley floor and hung between the limestone towers like smoke between the teeth of old gods. It was not a gentle kingdom. None of the old kingdoms were gentle. They were built by men with swords and the willingness to use them, and they were held together by the same combination of force and tradition and the occasional ruthless decision that most people preferred not to think about in daylight. The Ashenvale Dominion stretched from the northern ice fields to the southern river delta, encompassing somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 souls, depending on whether you counted the border villages that changed hands every other generation. It had 47 castles, 3 great cities, a dozen harbor towns, and exactly one king. King Aldrich, called the Ironborn, called in quieter company the Wolf King. He had earned the name twice over, once for the way he led his cavalry charges, low and fast and without mercy, appearing where he should not have been able to appear, hitting before the enemy had finished turning to face him, and once for the old blood that ran in his family line. The Ashenvale kings had carried the wolf strain for 6 generations. Most of them had been simply larger than they should have been, and stronger, and prone to silver eyes and strong light. A few of the older ones, in the old records, had been something rather more than that. Aldrich himself did not speak of it. He did not need to. The silver in his gaze did the speaking for him. He had earned the name twice over, once for the way he led his cavalry charges, low and fast and without mercy, appearing where he should not have been able to appear, hitting before the enemy had finished turning to face him, and once for the old blood that ran in his family line. The Ashenvale kings had carried the wolf strain for 6 generations. Most of them had been simply larger than they should have been, and stronger, and prone to silver eyes and strong light. A few of the older ones, in the old records, had been something rather more than that. Aldrich himself did not speak of it. He did not need to. The silver in his gaze did the speaking for him. Tone shifts slightly. Warmer, more intimate. Now place beside this king one girl. One ordinary girl in an extraordinary place, the way the best stories usually work. Marin of Holt, 19 years old, brown hair, quick hands, the kind of face that people looked through rather than at, because she had learned very early that invisibility was the most useful skill a servant could develop. She had come to Ashenvale Keep 3 years before, following her older brother who worked the kitchens, and had found her position as a lavender girl, which was not a title anyone had ever made official, but which described her function precisely. She walked the corridors of the keep with bundles of dried herbs, and hung them wherever the damp and the dogs and the candle smoke made the air thick and sour. She was good at it. She moved quietly. She noticed things. She had noticed, for instance, that the king looked different than the songs described. The song said Ironborn. The song said war and stone and absolute authority. They were not wrong, but they left out the way his eyes moved when he entered a room, not with the sweep of conquest, but with something quieter and more focused, something almost like caution, as if he were always calculating the distance between himself and the nearest threat. She had noticed this from a distance, of course, a great deal of distance. Kings and lavender girls did not share rooms, let alone conversations. The gap between them was not merely social, It was the kind of gap that the universe maintains between celestial bodies. They could exist in the same space. They simply operated in entirely different orbits, until the night the eclipse came and collapsed every orbit in the sky. Music drops to a single low tone. The drumbeat slows. Silence presses in. The eclipse of the Ashenvale summer came on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Great cosmic events should not arrive on ordinary weekdays. They should arrive at midnight or during thunderstorms, or at least on the kind of gray and threatening morning that allows people to feel, afterward, that they should have known. Instead, this one arrived at mid-afternoon, while the market road was crowded and the granary boys were arguing about a dog, and Marin of Holt was walking back from the apothecary with fresh lavender in her basket and absolutely nothing in her mind except whether she had time to hang the east corridor before supper. The shadow came from the west. It moved the way no natural shadow moves. Fast, deliberate, total. Not the creep of a passing cloud, but an arrival, a decision. The sun was there, and then it was simply not there, replaced by a burning ring of white fire at the edge of the dark. A crown of dying light around an absence that should not have been possible. The market stopped. The world stopped. Somewhere behind her, Marin heard the first scream. Music returns, something dark and urgent, building slowly. In the ancient texts of the Old Order, the ones that the priest kept in locked cabinets and read only in private, the eclipse was not described as an astronomical event. It was described as a hunger. The moon, they wrote, was not a dead rock hanging in the void. It was the eye of something that had been watching the world since before the world had words for what it was watching. And sometimes at specific conjunctions of time and tide and cosmic alignment, that eye blinked. And in the moment of its blinking, the boundary between the living and whatever lay on the other side grew thin as silk. The strong ones went first, always the strong ones. The wild and the vital and the ones who burned too bright. They drew the darkness the way a flame draws moths. The eclipse reached down and took them, and the priest said this was mercy. Better a clean taking than the long corruption of power and age, and the slow dimming of a great soul. Whether it was mercy or appetite, it amounted to the same thing. The kings of Ashenvale had feared eclipses for 6 generations, not openly, never openly, but the protocols existed, the sealed chambers, the guards at the outer solar doors, the specific instructions left by 7 generations of predecessors in the locked iron box that passed from king to king at coronation. Stay inside, stay low, do not stand near windows, wait it out. Aldrich the Ironborn knew these protocols. He had read them. He had decided with the absolute confidence of a man who had never yet encountered a force he could not outlast, that they applied to lesser men. He stood at his window and watched the eclipse come. The music stops entirely. Silence. Marin found him on the floor of the outer solar. She should not have been there. No protocol, no order, no reasonable chain of events placed a lavender girl in the Royal Solar during an eclipse emergency. But she had climbed the tower stairs anyway, led by something she could not name, a cold certainty in her chest that pulled her upward the way a current pulls a leaf, without asking permission. He was on his knees beside the great west window, the black eclipse light pouring over him like a tide. He was shaking, not with fear, but with effort. The effort of a man bracing against something enormous and invisible, the way you brace against a wind that no one else can feel. His hands were flat on the stone floor. His head was bowed, and his eyes, when he raised them to look at her, had gone completely silver, not gray, silver, like 2 coins laid over the face of the moon.
Your Majesty.
His gaze found her and held, and in that moment, she would spend months afterward trying to understand that moment. Something moved between them. Not words, not feeling exactly, though feeling was part of it. Something more fundamental, like a recognition, like 2 instruments tuning to each other across an empty hall.
Come here.
His voice was rough and low and very quiet. She came. She crossed the floor and knelt beside him on the cold stone, and he caught her hand with a grip that was not desperate, but absolute. The grip of a man who has chosen his anchor and intends to hold.
Do not be afraid.
I am not afraid.
Which was not true, but which became truer the moment she said it. And then the eclipse completed its work. He exhaled, long, slow, final, and the light went out of his eyes and his hand went slack, and the Wolf King of Ashenvale was dead on the floor of his own solar, with no one beside him but a girl who hung lavender in corridors. Maren held his hand for a long time after. She was not sure why. Perhaps because releasing it felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit. Perhaps because the warmth in his palm lingered longer than warmth should linger, as if his body was reluctant to give up the fight entirely. Perhaps because in the 7 minutes between his first look at her and his last breath, she had felt something she did not have a name for. She stayed until she heard footsteps on the stairs. Then she stood. She smoothed her apron. She picked up her lavender basket. She left before anyone could find her there. Long pause, low music returns. She did not know yet that she would see him again. She did not know that in 3 nights' time, something would knock on her window. She did not know that the eclipse did not only take. Sometimes in the old text that no one read anymore, there was a second passage, a footnote in another hand, written smaller and with less certainty. It said, "The eclipse consumes, but what it cannot digest, it returns. Changed, but returned." Complete silence for 3 full seconds. Then a single knock. Slow, deliberate, 3 times. Music begins very softly. 3 nights after the eclipse, Maren of Holt was lying awake in her narrow bed in the servant wing of Ashenvale Keep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about grief. Not her grief exactly. She had no right to grieve him. She understood that. You did not grieve men you had spoken to once, for 7 minutes, while they were dying. You certainly did not grieve kings. That was not what Lavender Girls were for. But something had lodged in her chest since that afternoon on the solar floor. Something small and persistent and entirely unreasonable. And it sat there now in the dark and refused to be rational about the situation. The keep had moved on efficiently. Grief, in courts and kingdoms, was a brief ceremony quickly replaced by logistics. The Lord Chamberlain had announced the king's passing. The succession protocols had been activated. 3 clan riders had already arrived from the outer reaches, and more were coming. The throne of Ashenvale was empty, and the emptiness was drawing men the way blood draws the things that hunt in winter. None of this was Maren's concern. She was aware of this. She lay in her bed and told herself she was going to sleep, and the thing in her chest disagreed with her, and she was losing the argument when something knocked on her window. 3 knocks, slow, patient. Her window was on the 2nd floor. Nothing should have been able to reach it. She lay still for a long moment. Then she rose. Then she crossed the room. Then she opened the shutter. He was standing in the alley below, looking up at her. He was barefoot. He was dressed in the burial shroud they had dressed him in 3 nights ago. White linen, now dusty and wrinkled with what appeared to be the experience of being interred and then uninterred. His hair was loose. There was dried earth on his hands and at his collar. And his eyes, in the thin moonlight of that 3 nights after sky, were pure silver from edge to edge. No gray at all, no shadow, just silver, clear and still, like windows into somewhere else entirely. He was looking up at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not relief, though relief was somewhere in it. Not urgency, though that was there too. Something quieter than either. The look of a man who has been walking in darkness for a very long time and has just, for the first time, seen a light he recognizes.
You died. I was there.
Her voice was completely steady, which surprised her.
I believe you. I have no memory of it. I have no memory of anything, in fact, except your face. I followed it here like a lamp in a dark room.
Maren looked at him for a long time.
She ran through the options. She could close the shutter and go back to bed. She could call for the guard. She could scream, which would bring the entire keep running within 90 seconds. She could pray to whatever saint oversaw situations involving dead kings appearing alive in service alleys. If such a saint existed, which she rather doubted. She could see from this angle that he was shivering. Not dramatically, just slightly, with the controlled shiver of a large animal holding itself still through effort rather than warmth. He had been in the ground for 3 days. Whatever the eclipse had done when it returned him, It had apparently not thought to include shoes.
Wait there. I will find you shoes.
This was, she would later acknowledge, a somewhat inadequate response to a resurrection. But it was practical, and practical in Marin's experience was the thing most needed in a crisis. Anyone could panic. Anyone could flee or freeze or fall apart. The useful thing, the rare thing, was to look at an impossible situation and identify the first small step toward managing it. The first small step was shoes. He could not navigate a kingdom barefoot. The larger problems could follow in order. Music builds slightly, something cautious and intimate. She brought him her brother's old boots, which were 2 sizes too small and required a great deal of effort to put on, and a heavy cloak from the laundry stores that she told herself she would return before anyone noticed. She also brought bread and a wedge of hard cheese from the kitchen because she was 19 years old and had been feeding people since she was 8, and her first instinct in any crisis was to establish whether everyone had eaten. He ate without speaking, sitting against the far granary wall with the focused attention of a man who has been away from his body for 3 days and finds its requirements both urgent and faintly surprising. She watched him and tried to organize her thoughts, which were currently arranged in the manner of a room that has just been turned upside down.
What do you remember?
Your face, clearly. The color of your eyes in eclipse light. The way your hand felt when you held mine.
He looked up at her. Something in his expression made her want to look away. She did not.
I remember the sensation of leaving, and then nothing. And then waking in the dark with my hands against stone, and the knowledge that there was something I needed to find. You were the something.
Why me?
She meant it as a genuine question, not a protest. Why the Lavender Girl and not the Lord Chamberlain, or his generals, or anyone of actual consequence?
I do not know yet, but I suspect the eclipse does not make mistakes. Whatever the connection between us is, it is older than either of us understands.
This was not a comfortable answer. It was, however, the most interesting thing anyone had said to Marn of Holt in the entire 19 years of her life. So she sat down on a grain sack across from the dead king, who was alive again, and she listened, and the night stretched around them like a held breath. Music shifts, something urgent, moving, low percussion. The tunnel beneath the laundry was 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, and had not been used in 30 years. This was apparent from the smell of it, and from the spiders, and from the section near the midpoint where the ceiling had partly collapsed, and they had to move on hands and knees through 8 feet of absolute dark with crumbling stone pressing down from above. The king moved through all of it without a word of complaint, which Marin found both admirable and faintly unnerving. She led with a stub of candle she had taken from the laundry stores. He followed without asking how much farther, or whether the ceiling would hold, or any of the questions that any reasonable person in his position would have been asking. He simply moved when she moved and stopped when she stopped and trusted, with a completeness that made her uncomfortable, that she knew where she was going. She did know. This was part of her invisibility advantage. Servants learned the spaces that lords and knights never bothered to learn: the back passages, the servant stairs, the old tunnels and forgotten doors. She had walked this tunnel twice before, exploring in her first year at the keep when she had nothing better to do on her days off, and the city above her was still a mystery. She had not imagined on either of those exploratory walks that she would one day use it to smuggle a resurrected monarch past 3 invading clan armies. But here they were. The tunnel emerged behind the old mill wheel on the river's south bank, in a district of warehouses and tanning yards and the kind of cheap lodging houses that asked no questions, because the answers were invariably complicated. Marin had a contact here, an entirely coincidental contact, a woman named Bess who ran a boarding house and who had grown up 2 villages from Marin's own home in Holt, and who owed Marin a favor from 2 years prior involving a misaddressed letter and a lord's son who should not have been writing letters. Bess opened her door in the pre-dawn dark, took one long look at the 2 of them, the small woman with the candle stub and the enormous silver-eyed man in the burial shroud, and said without audible surprise,
"You will be wanting the back room then."
Practical women, Marin reflected, found each other. Music quiets. Intimate space, firelight in the scene. The back room was small and clean and had a proper fire, and a bed that was not a grain sack. And Aldrich, she had begun, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to call him by his name, which felt presumptuous and also unavoidable, sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands again in the firelight. He had been doing this, she noticed, looking at his hands, as if the information in them was changing and he was trying to keep up.
Tell me what I should know about the clans, about the succession, about what they want.
So she told him. The Vora clan from the northern reaches, who had been challenging Ashenvale's border rights for a decade, and now saw an open throne as their best opportunity in living memory. The Stonefall lords from the Central Valleys, who had a distant claim to the throne through a female line that most people regarded as legally dubious, but militarily significant, since the Stonefall had 12,000 swords at their disposal. And the Iron Reach, the Eastern Mountain clans, who wanted not the throne itself, but the river trade rights that came with controlling whoever sat on it. She told him about the Chamberlain, whose loyalty she did not trust, and whose efficiency she respected, and who had moved in 3 days to position himself as the kingmaker rather than the king's servant. About the court astrologer's announcement of the devouring pair, the second eclipse, 14 days out, which the priests were treating as a deadline, and the clans as an opportunity. She told him about the heresy law, about the standing order to report any signs of resurrection. She told him all of it in the practical voice she used for managing difficult situations, and he listened with the total attention of a man to whom this information was tactically vital and personally terrifying, and who was refusing to allow the second quality to interfere with the first.
You know a great deal about the politics of this court. For a lavender girl.
Servants hear everything. Lords speak freely in front of us. They do not think of us as listeners.
Do they not?
We are furniture to them, very useful furniture that occasionally has ears.
Something moved in his expression that might, in better lighting, have been the beginning of a smile.
And what do you think of that? Being furniture?
She considered the question honestly.
I think invisibility is power, just a different kind than the sort with banners and cavalry. And I think the lords of Ashenvale have been making decisions based on the assumption that no one is listening for a very long time. That is a significant strategic weakness.
He looked at her for a long moment.
It is. I was one of those lords.
You were.
She did not soften it.
And now?
Now you are a man in a borrowed cloak in a Mill District boarding house with 14 days to reclaim your throne. The situation has changed somewhat.
He looked at his hands, then he looked at her. And for the first time, something in the rigid, controlled gravity of his expression shifted into something more genuinely human. Not the king's face, not the ironborn face, but the face of a man who finds himself, against all probability, grateful for where he has landed.
Then why does your heartbeat still answer mine?
It was not a non sequitur. She understood immediately what he meant. She had felt it too. That tuning fork resonance, that sense of being heard below the level of words. It had been there in the solar when he died. It was here now, in the small back room with the fire in the borrowed boots. As if the eclipse, in returning him to her, had tied something between them that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them could quite bring themselves to question.
I do not know, but it is there.
Yes, it is.
Outside the Mill District window, the first light of pre-dawn began to gray the sky. Somewhere in the city above them, the bells of the keep rang the morning toll. And in the keep, in the throne room, in the war rooms, in the chambers of 3 competing clans, the machines of power began to move. They had 14 days the clock had started. Music deepens, something that is romantic and dangerous in equal measure. The days in the Mill District had a particular texture. They were not peaceful. Nothing about their situation permitted peace. Bess had contacts in the market, and through her they received daily intelligence. The clan riders were searching house by house in the noble quarter. The Chamberlain had hired trackers from the Iron Reach. A reward had been posted, not for the king. They could not post a reward for a man they had declared dead without inviting questions, but for information regarding the eclipse's aberrations. The priest had written 17 separate pamphlets explaining why any rumors of resurrection were spiritually dangerous, and anyone spreading them would be considered an enemy of the natural order. They were efficient, Marin gave them that. But the Mill District was not the noble quarter. Its people had different loyalties. The tanners and river workers and boarding house keepers of the South Bank were not, by temperament, inclined to cooperate with pamphlets. Several of them had, over the years, found cause to be grateful to various anonymous persons for various kinds of help. Bess was a woman who remembered debts and collected them thoughtfully. The back room remained undiscovered. What grew in that undiscovered room was harder to categorize. They worked in the first days purely on logistics. Marin had the court knowledge, the names, the faces, the alliances, the debts and grudges and vulnerabilities of every lord and knight and functionary she had observed for 3 years from her advantageous position as invisible furniture. He had the military knowledge, strategy, logistics, the architecture of power, the specific levers that moved armies. Together they mapped the path back to his throne, the way one plans a siege, methodically without sentiment, acknowledging every obstacle before committing to the approach. He was remarkable to work with. This was not what she had expected. She had expected the king, the Ironborn, the man of banners and cavalry charges. She had not expected the quality of his listening. He listened the way very few people listened, completely without preparing his next point, without diminishing what she said by making it smaller than it was. When she told him something about a lord's weakness or a courtier's loyalty, he received it as information of full weight, regardless of where it came from. He also, she noticed, never once referred to what she was doing as help. He referred to it as work, their work, as though it had been established from the beginning that this was a joint enterprise and her contribution was not charity, but partnership. She found this deeply, unexpectedly disarming. Music softens, more intimate. On the 5th night, she asked him what he remembered about being dead. She had been wanting to ask since the alley. She had held the question back because it seemed presumptuous, and then because they had been busy, and then because she was not certain she wanted the answer. But the 5th night was quiet and the fire was low, and he was sitting across from her with that focused stillness of his, and she asked,
"Nothing."
And then more slowly,
"That is not entirely true. There is no memory of it. But there is a knowledge. The way you know the shape of a room you have been in, even in total dark."
What shape was it?
He was quiet for a long time.
"Old, vast, not threatening. I do not think threatening is the right word, more like indifferent, as if everything that felt large in this world was very small from there. Ambition, power, even fear."
He paused.
"You were not small, though. In that place, you were the only thing that had any weight at all. You were the reason the way back had a direction."
Marin looked at the fire.
That frightens me.
"Why?"
Because I am nobody. Because I do not understand why the eclipse, or whatever is on the other side of it, would use a lavender girl as a compass.
He leaned forward slightly, his silver eyes steady and warm in a way that silver eyes had no right to be warm.
"I have been thinking about this. The eclipse takes the ones who burn too bright. That is what the priests say. And I think they mean it as a kind of warning about power. But I wonder if they have it partly wrong. I think the eclipse takes the ones who are most alive, and what it cannot hold, the part of a soul that has found something worth returning to. It sends back."
He held her gaze.
"You were worth returning to, Marin of Holt. That is not a nothing. That is the most significant thing the cosmos has said about either of us."
She did not know what to do with this. She was a practical woman. She dealt in concrete things, herb bundles and siege tunnels and bread theft and political intelligence. She was not equipped by training or temperament. For a man who had come back from the dead and was sitting across from her in firelight telling her that her existence had been sufficient to pull him back from whatever lay beyond. She was not equipped for it, but she felt it and had felt it since the solar floor, and feelings did not wait for equipment.
Music builds, the finale movement, drums, strings, something that is both triumphant and unresolved. The plan came together on the 12th day. It was not, Marin acknowledged privately, a perfect plan. It had 7 points at which it could fail catastrophically and required the cooperation of 4 people whose loyalty rested on debts rather than conviction, and assumed that the Stonefall clan's representative was precisely as vain as her intelligence suggested, which was a significant assumption on which to hang a king's return. It is the best plan I have encountered in 11 years of ruling. He said this straight-faced, and she was nearly certain he meant it as a compliment. What the plan required at its center was a confrontation, not a battle. They had no army, not an assassination. That was not the kind of king he intended to be returned as. What it required was a room, the specific room in Ashenvale Keep where the 3 clan representatives had gathered to divide the throne they believed was vacant. And his presence in that room, on his terms, at the precise moment when the competing claims had driven the negotiations to their most fractious point, and every man in that room was too invested in his own position to think clearly. What it required was for Marin to get him into that room, and for the Wolf King to do the rest. The pace of narration increases, urgent, propulsive. She had memorized the keep in 3 years of invisible walking. She knew which guards on the night rotation could be relied upon to be asleep at the 3rd hour. She knew which corridor connected the undercroft to the back passage of the Great Hall without passing through any of the 4 main checkpoints the Chamberlain had established. She knew which side door was hung wrong on its hinges and could be opened from outside with a piece of bent iron if you applied pressure in precisely the right way. She had the piece of bent iron. She had noted its potential months ago, the way she noted all things, from habit and from the deep servant's understanding that information was the only currency available to those without power or title. She had noted it and filed it and moved on, and now she walked through the 13th night of the Wolf King's second life and used it. The Great Hall was lit with 100 candles when they reached the gallery above it. Below, the Chamberlain sat at the head of the long table, and around it the representatives of Vorik, Stonefall, in the Iron Reach, and a dozen lords of Ashenvale, all of them speaking with the controlled urgency of men who know that tomorrow the second eclipse comes, and after the second eclipse, the window of easy succession closes, and the hard kind of succession, the kind with armies, becomes inevitable. Marin pressed herself against the gallery wall and looked down and felt the cold certainty in her bones that had been her companion since the afternoon in the solar. He stood beside her. He had dressed in the last 2 days from resources Bess had provided. Real clothes now, plain but fitted, a dark wool that suited him. He had his hands quiet at his sides. His silver eyes were scanning the room below with the absolute focus of a man who has been in enough rooms like this to know exactly what each person's posture means and what they will do next.
Are you ready?
He looked at her, and in looking at her, something in his expression did what it had been doing for 13 days in increments, shifted, opened, became the face not of a king or a soldier or a strategist, but of a man who has been found by something he did not know he was missing.
You died in my arms.
She had not planned to say it. It came out as a statement of fact, of grounding, of the specific weight that their beginning carried.
Then why does your heartbeat still answer mine?
Not a question, a statement. The answer to an argument neither of them had finished making. Below them, the Chamberlain's voice rose in the controlled desperation of a man watching his careful arrangements begin to dissolve. The clan lords were on their feet. 3 men were speaking at once. The Great Hall of Ashenvale was 30 seconds from fracture. Aldrich the Ironborn turned toward the gallery stairs. He descended. He walked through the side door and into the light of 100 candles, and the room fell silent the way rooms fall silent when something enters that no one in them has the language to immediately describe. He stood at the end of the table and looked at them, all of them, the Chamberlain who had buried him, the clan lords who had come to claim his throne, his own lords who had bent their heads to the succession and told themselves this was the natural order. He looked at all of them with silver eyes in candlelight and said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched. Then,
You have been sitting at my table, and I have not been intruders.
the Chamberlain turned the color of old chalk. The clan representatives looked at each other with the specific expression of men who have just realized the ground they were standing on was not ground. And somewhere above them, in the gallery, Marianne of Holt leaned against the cold stone wall and felt the thing in her chest, the unreasonable, unnamed, 14-day-old thing, expand into something too large for its original container. He had not looked back at her when he descended the stairs. He had not needed to. She had felt him go the way you feel a tide turn. Not with your eyes, but with something older than eyes, something in the body that knows the water's movement before the surface shows it. He was going to be all right. She was not sure yet what that meant for her. Music softens to something quietly triumphant and bittersweet. Let it breathe. The second eclipse came and passed. It came at dawn on the 14th day, spreading its dark hand across the sky of Ashenvale the way the first one had. Total, inevitable, hungry. The priest prayed. The clan riders who had not yet left the city pressed themselves into doorways and looked at the black sun with the specific terror of men who have spent 2 weeks being told that something unnatural was loose in the kingdom. The Wolf King stood in the window of his reclaimed throne room and watched it come without flinching. He had, in the 46 hours between his return to the Great Hall and the arrival of the second eclipse, done what he did. He had spoken and maneuvered and pressed on the specific points of vulnerability that Marin's intelligence had identified. And the Stonefall representative had cracked first, as predicted, and the Iron Reach had followed on the trade agreement that had been in negotiation for 3 years and required only a signature to complete. And the Vorak clan's representative had found himself alone in his position, significantly less committed to a confrontation than he had been 48 hours before. The Chamberlain had been removed from his position. This had been handled quietly and with the specific precision of a man who had spent 13 days doing nothing but planning, and who had in his possession a servant girl's 3 years of invisible observation. The throne of Ashenvale was no longer empty. A beat, then softer. He found her after. In the corridor outside the East Gallery, which she had been rehanging with lavender because someone had to, and it was her job, and she did not yet know what she was beyond her job. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were identifiable now, something she had learned in 14 days of close company, the particular weight and rhythm of them. She did not turn immediately. She finished securing the bundle she was working on because it seemed important to finish.
You could have left after the hall. You had done enough.
I know.
Why didn't you?
She turned. He was standing in the corridor in his king's clothes, real ones now, not burial linen, not borrowed wool, and the candlelight made his silver eyes warm in a way that still surprised her. And the thing in her chest was doing what it had been doing since the solar floor, which was refusing to behave reasonably.
Because the eclipse sent you back to me, and I have been thinking about what that means, and I think it means I am supposed to stay and find out.
He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the controlled deliberateness of a man who has calculated the distance between himself and the thing he wants and decided to cross it, he reached out and took her hand. Not the grip of a dying man this time, not desperation or need, just the quiet, chosen hold of a king who has come back from the dark and knows, with the clarity that only the dark can give, what he came back for.
Then stay, Marin of Holt, and I will spend whatever time the eclipse has left, me making it worth your while.
Outside, the second eclipse completed its passage. The dark eye blinked and closed, and the sun returned. The ordinary, burning, relentless sun, and the world below it was the same and was not the same at all. That is the thing about eclipses. They do not only take. Sometimes in the oldest texts, in the footnotes written in a smaller and less certain hand, sometimes they return what they cannot hold, what burns too particular, what is tied to something too specific to be swallowed whole. A king who remembered only one face, a girl who caught him when he fell, and whatever the darkness between those two things had made of them. This has been the Eclipse of Love Chronicles, tonight's tale, When the Moon Ate the King.